friends are since.
Recently I picked up this handheld emulator device called an Anbernic 351M to experiment with, and I did that partly because I'd seen fellow Dirty Wave M8 user Avril Cadabra using one for LSDJ, but to be honest I also just liked the idea of being able to play Commodore 64 games wherever I was. Now one of the cool things about the RG351M and other similar devices is that they can emulate a huge range of different computers, so everything from the Commodore 64 to the Amiga to different arcade machines to SNES, Game Boy, all that kind of thing. And one of the things I was curious about was finding old and different kinds of music making software that I haven't been able to try out before. One of the ones I came across was this homebrew application for the Sony PSP called Rhythm 8. This is essentially a basic sample-based sequencer, and I think it came out in 2008 or maybe even earlier than that. At first I thought it was going to be a bit of a crappy kind of limited DIY application, especially because I had a few glitches and stuff when I was running it on the handheld device, but I downloaded a PSP emulator for my Mac, and it turns out that it runs quite well on the desktop as opposed to the handheld, and actually it seems like it's pretty cool and it's fairly deceptively powerful. Unfortunately, the software itself is no longer maintained, and there aren't any videos on YouTube that I could find that talk about the Rhythm 8 specifically, or the kinds of features that are in there. There are a bunch of videos that show off some of the songs made with Rhythm 8 and stuff like that, but nothing that really talk about it. So I thought I would do a video to talk about some of my experiences, some of the things that I think are particularly cool about it, and then if you're curious you can go and try it for yourself. Now I'm not going to be talking about specific buttons or controls or anything like that, because that's going to obviously vary depending on your own particular setup, and I'm also not going to go into too much detail on the features because I started to do that and it very quickly got too long and too boring. But if people are interested, then maybe I can do a walkthrough of the features at some point in the future. Now I mentioned that I'm running an emulator on my Mac. It's called PPSSPP. It also runs on Windows, Android and I think Linux, but don't quote me on that. So again, if you want to try this out, you can just go download it for free. It is a wee bit of a pain in the arse to set up on the Mac, but it's not impossible, so you can go look that up for yourself. And honestly, it seems to run fairly well, at least in my experience. So I'm just going to load up the Rhythm 8 here and let you see it. It's got a rather nice load screen here of a particular time and style. Now we come to a menu here and you'll have missed it because it just opened too fast, but essentially you have a new load, save, options and exit, and I'll just dive straight in and go to a new song so I can show you how things work. The way things that are set up in here conceptually is that we've got two main modes. We've got a pattern mode and a song mode. Pattern mode is where we create patterns, edit sounds and all that good stuff, and as part of that there are 4 different views. So there's the pattern view itself, track view, wave view and different effects. Song mode, as you may guess, is where you combine different patterns together to create a playable song. Now within the pattern view, this is where you load up your samples and lay out patterns. Each pattern by default is 32 steps long, spread across one bar, and this is great because you get quite a lot of divisions between or in the bar itself, which means you can do really quick rolls and stuff quite nicely. However, you can also go into the options here and change the resolution, so you can change the way the pattern scales across 1 bar or 2 bars, and the other option in here is you can go to 16 steps over 2 bars, and as far as I understand it, that means you get a wee bit less resolution in terms of the placement of your notes or steps or whatever, but you get much longer, and this is quite useful. But for now I'm just going to leave it at 32 steps because that will be easier for these purposes. The other thing to note in here is that you can change the length of the pattern from 32 steps down the way. You can't go above 32, it would have been nice, but you can go down the way in multiples of 2, all the way down to 2. Although 2 steps would be very odd, and I don't know why that's even in there as an option. The way things are laid out in this view is fairly straightforward. We have 16 different tracks down the left hand side. On each track you can load in a different sample. For each one of these we have a mute control and a solo control, and then you add in your steps here. At the top we have a volume control, balance, so that's pan, and then we have this threshold and resonance of, cutoff and resonance for a filter. We also have tempo control, so you can adjust the speed globally. Now for each track we can load in different samples, and there's a selection of basic samples or sounds included when you download the software, but you can also load your own samples in there just by dropping them into folders, which is pretty cool. One thing to note is that it doesn't like samples above 24-bit, and I did a bit of testing, but really it seems like you're best if you stick to samples that are 16-bit 44.1. So in here you'll see the kind of standard folder structure that you get when you download this stuff. Within drums, there's a bunch of drum samples included, as I mentioned, but I've added a bunch of my own ones. And you'll see here that if I load up the 24-bit samples and I press the button to cue or addition the sounds, it doesn't work. So you need to stick with the 16-bit samples and everything will work fine. Now, I'll pick a kick drum here and a few other drums to lay down and show you what's going on. I'm pretty sure these are ones that were included with the ROM. You can addition by pressing a button, which is nice. So I'll just lay out a couple of things. We'll put in a hi-hat, a kick and a snare, and I'll quickly do the world's most basic drum pattern just so we have an example. As you can see, making a pattern is really straightforward and you lay things out as you might expect. Now, one cool thing is that if you click or press twice or for a second time on a step, it'll go blue, and what this does is reverse the sample, which is actually pretty cool, and it's nice that you can do that really easily. So let's do it on this one. So that's pretty smart and something that I actually quite like. Now, in terms of navigating between patterns, you switch left or right, and if you look down the bottom, you'll see that we're going up the way, and we have lots of different patterns here that we can start to fill out and flesh out our sequences. There are 64 different patterns available in total, which means we have quite a lot of room for making interesting variations. One thing that's really annoying is there's no easy way to just copy a pattern from one place to another without having to go through a kind of laborious process. And to explain what I mean, if you want to copy, say, pattern 1 to pattern 2, what you have to do is go into the options menu, copy pattern, select the source and the destination, okay, back out, back into here, and now you'll see it's there. And this is something that within a sequencer like this, you're going to be doing a lot, so it doesn't make any sense to me why the process has got so many steps. There should surely be like a hotkey or some way where you can just copy everything and paste it onto the next screen. But I've been using this for a while and I haven't figured it out, and it doesn't seem like the manual says that you can do that without having to go into the options menu. So that is the biggest thing I dislike about the Rhythm 8, and if there was just a wee hotkey, it would make things so much easier. Anyway, if you're making sequences with drums, then this kind of layout makes a lot of sense and is pretty straightforward. But let's say we add in an instrument. So let's find just a bass sound. If we just start laying them out on here as steps, then obviously they're all going to be at the same pitch. And you might think, well, that's, what do I do now? How do I get actual melodies out of this thing? And this is where the track view comes in. And as you can see, it's a fairly straightforward piano roll. So you can start to do things like this. Might not win any prizes in terms of the melody, but you get the idea. The other screen that we want to talk about is the wave screen, as it's called. And essentially in here we have different kind of parameters that can shape the sound depending on the sample type that you set. So you can either have an ADSR or you can have sample trimming options. And when I refer to the sample type, I'm referring to the way that Rhythm 8 looks at different samples. So for example, you might have a one shot, you might have a loop, or you might have a synth which plays oscillator files, kind of like a wavetable, which is a pretty cool effect or feature of Rhythm 8. And to get to all of that stuff, we go to the effects view. Now within the effects view there's a few things to note. You can change the sample type of each here. So the default is sample, that is just a one shot, plays once. We have a loop, which means that once the sample is finished playing back, it will play again. And this is particularly useful if you want to set start and end points and create a kind of quasi-synth using this. It's one way to do it. And then synth is the bit where you can just put in really tiny snippets and use the wavetable type stuff, which is pretty cool. The other notable things to talk about in here are this column, which is standard or advanced. So you can switch between both of these. And the difference is that in standard mode, when you make a change to a parameter, that applies to all steps on that track. Whereas advanced mode is a bit more like the parameter lock kind of thing that you would get in Electron devices, where each step will have its own separate parameters. So you could change the start and end point ostensibly on a sample, and that would let you play back different parts. And so you could, in theory, chop up different bits and make kind of breaks with this, but there isn't any kind of visible waveform that I've found in here, so doing so might be quite difficult. The manual does suggest there is or should be a waveform, but I can't see one, and I don't know whether it's an emulator issue or whether it's just this version of the ROM or what again, but either way, if you wanted to do that kind of hip-hop style stuff in here, you could do it. It wouldn't be easy, but you could do it. But you could also do other cool things like change the filter on each step or change, the ADSR, etc. So that's how you would do it. In terms of effects, we have the ability to change the kind of filter that applies on each track, whether it's a low-pass filter or a high-pass filter. There's no bandpass or anything like that, that is all you have. But there are some other effects baked in here, and included are a bit of variety of kind of standard things like distortions and delays, but then you also have some other weirder ones like a time stretch. And I haven't, to be honest, really figured out how this works yet in practice because it's a bit odd. And they have this thing, which is a slicer, I believe. And to me, this just sounds like a kind of volume LFO or amplitude LFO. The other ones are distortion, delay. Now you might notice that there's a couple of different distortions in here and a couple of different kinds of delays, and they aren't actually different types of delays, which is what I thought initially. It's just that they allow you to have different parameters on each delay. So for example, if we set up delay 1 here, right, and we set the feedback all the way up to 85.6, then I want, say, this track here to have a different kind of delay with a different kind of feedback length. If you put in delay 1, it's going to take the parameters from delay 1. So they're mirrored across. You can't individually change them. It's not like this is a copy of delay 1. Delay 1 is kind of like, you imagine you have an actual effects box and that's it. There's one of them. So if you wanted to add on a different kind of delay parameter onto your second track or whatever, you'd have to use the second delay. And the same thing applies with distortion. So I'll add on a wee bit so you get an idea of how this sounds. As simple as that, and the cool thing is you can stack the effects as well, which means you can get some really meaty distortion in there if that's what you so desire. So once you have a bunch of different patterns created, you go into song mode, and this is where you lay out the different patterns to make up your song that can then be played back later. And it's actually pretty powerful. You have here up to 99, I believe, song steps. And on each step, you can choose the pattern and choose which tracks you want activated from that particular pattern. So let's say we have pattern 1, and we want to start our drums slowly coming in, then we can do that fairly easily, like so. And what will happen here, you can see we'll go through, the kick drum will start, then the hi-hat will come in, then the bass will come in from pattern 1. But let's say we wanted to then move on to pattern 2, then what we can do is do the exact same thing, and you just shift things at the top. So now we've got pattern 2 that will come in here. So if I press play, you'll get an idea of how that works. So now that you've got your song all laid out and hopefully sounding much better than my efforts, then what can you do with it? Well, if you go into the main menu here and we hit save, you can of course save your project file, but you can also export the song audio directly to a WAV file, which is amazing because this then means you don't have to faff about with kind of weird audio routing within software or anything to get your creations out of there. But the other amazing thing, which is something that I definitely did not expect, is that you can export the individual patterns to WAV files themselves. So if we open this up, you'll see we've got pattern 2 here, and you can export pattern 2, and that'll just take that bit. But you can also quite easily cycle between them. So you could very quickly export all of the patterns in your song. Well, maybe not if you've got 64, that may take a wee bit longer, but at least the option is there. And the other cool thing about this is that it respects mute and solo states. So if you wanted to export individual tracks, then all you would have to do is go in and mute each one or solo each one and export it one at a time. And that way, this gives you a lot of power over creating patterns that you can then take and put in your DAW and do things with them, which really greatly enhances the capabilities and the kind of power of using this thing to make music with. So I'm really excited about this bit in particular. The other cool feature in here, which is worth a mention, is that when you export your song as a WAV audio file, it also exports a corresponding MIDI file for the song with each of the tracks broken out. So I don't use MIDI files myself all that often, but I dropped it into Logic to see if it would work, and it does seem to do what it should be doing. So if you wanted to use the Rhythm 8 as a kind of interesting MIDI sequencer, you could also do that, and it's just a nice wee touch to have that in there. Not something I expected from an application like this, to be honest. So that is Rhythm 8, really, and if like me you're interested in slightly strange or quirky ways of making music and breaking out of the kind of standard workflows that you get stuck in, then perhaps you want to check it out for yourself. As I mentioned, it isn't maintained any longer and you can't even download it from the old official site anymore. However, it is available on the Internet Archive and you can run it on a PSP emulator. You can use a variety of different PSP emulators, but PPSSPP is the one that I've been using. I've been using this Bluetooth controller because I find it a bit easier, but you can use a keyboard as well if you don't have a gamepad or anything like that. To sum up, I'm fairly surprised at how cool this little sequencer is, and the fact that you can export individual patterns direct to audio files actually makes it pretty useful and more than just some wee toy that you would play about with in the bus or something like that. If you've got an old PSP lying around and want a portable way to make music, then this could actually be quite an affordable and accessible way to do that. Even if you don't have a PSP at the moment, you can pick them up for about £35 second hand, and so it's not even that high a barrier to entry if you don't have one yet. It is a bit glitchy on my RG351 emulator, which is a shame, but given the cost of the second-hand PSPs, I'm almost actually tempted to get one just to run this. But I guess I'll see how I go with it over the next few months and whether or not I actually make a lot of use out of it or not when it's on the Mac. Hopefully that's useful or interesting. If you do try it out or you do know how to copy patterns without having to go into the options menu, please do let me know because it's driving me bonkers. But for now, thank you for watching. Goodbye. To close out, I'm just going to leave you with a terrible bit of music that I put together on my very first attempt with the Rhythm 8, and I'm sure you'll be able to do far more better than this. But I've tried to use mostly or almost entirely just samples that came with the thing, so don't judge me too harshly.